Every video about Sparta mentions the Krypteia, the system where young Spartan men were sent into the countryside at night to hunt and kill helots as a graduation exercise in murder. It is the detail that most reliably produces shock in audiences learning about Sparta for the first time, and it deserves that reaction. The Krypteia was genuinely brutal, but the Krypteia was not the most powerful institution of control in Sparta. It was not even close. The most powerful institution of control in Sparta was a council of 5 men called the Ephors, elected annually from the general citizen population. They held combined judicial, legislative, executive, religious, and military powers that made them, in practice, the supreme authority in the Spartan state. Above the kings, above the generals, above the gerousia of elders that served as Sparta's senate. They could arrest a king. They could put a king on trial. They could depose a king. They could execute a king. They did all of these things to multiple kings across centuries of documented Spartan history. 2 Ephors followed every king on military campaign, not to assist him, but to watch him and report back. The king could not make a significant military or diplomatic decision without their oversight. If the Ephors decided the king had acted improperly, they could recall him to Sparta, strip him of command, and put him before a court where the verdict was determined by the same institution that had brought the charges. Aristotle, who studied the Spartan system in detail as part of his broader analysis of Greek constitutions, described the Ephorate as a tyranny operating within a state that called itself a constitutional monarchy. He was not being hyperbolic. He was describing the documented mechanics of an institution that had no equivalent check on its own power, that could do to others what no institution could do to it. Hollywood never made a film about the Ephors. The word barely appears in any popular treatment of Sparta. The institution that actually ran the city, that deposed kings, managed foreign policy, oversaw the Krypteia itself, and controlled the education system that produced the soldiers the films celebrate, is essentially invisible in the popular understanding of what Sparta was. This video is going to fix that. The word ephor comes from the Greek epi, meaning over, and horao, meaning to see, overseer. The title describes the function precisely. 5 men elected to watch everything and everyone, including the kings, and to act on what they observed. The institution appears in the historical record as early as 754 BC, when Alexandrian scholars compiled lists of Ephors dating back to that year. The origins are contested. Some ancient sources attributed the creation of the Ephorate to Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver, whose historical existence is itself debated by scholars. Others argued it was created during the Mycenaean Wars as a practical solution to the problem of maintaining state authority when the kings were away on campaign. Either way, by the time Sparta enters the well-documented historical record of the 5th century BC, the Ephorate is fully established and functioning as the primary executive power of the state. The 5 Ephors were elected annually by the assembly of Spartan citizens. Theoretically, any adult male citizen could be elected. This sounds democratic, and in a narrow sense it was. The institution was not hereditary, not monopolized by a specific family, not purchased or inherited. A poor Spartan citizen could theoretically become an Ephor. What the annual election actually produced in practice was an institution of enormous power, with extremely short terms and no formal accountability once the term ended. An Ephor who had spent a year making enemies while exercising near absolute power was after that year simply a private citizen again. The institutional memory, the relationships, and the informal networks that made the Ephorate function persisted across terms, while the formal accountability that might have constrained individual Ephors was minimal. They swore an oath monthly on behalf of the state. The kings swore a separate oath monthly on their own behalf. The distinction matters. The Ephors represented the state, the kings represented themselves. This asymmetry was built into the constitutional structure, and it determined who had the legitimacy to act when the two came into conflict. The structural relationship between the Ephors and the Krypteia, the institution that does appear in popular treatments of Sparta, is worth establishing precisely. because the two were not parallel or competing systems. The Krypteia operated under the supervision of the Ephors. Every year when the Ephors declared the ritual war against the helots that provided the legal framework for the Krypteia killings, it was the Ephors issuing that declaration. The young men who went out at night with daggers were operating under the institutional authority of the Ephorate. This means the Ephors were not simply an alternative to the Krypteia's violence. They were the authority that sanctioned, organized, and directed that violence as one instrument among several. The Krypteia controlled the helot population through terror from below. The Ephorate controlled the king and the citizen body through institutional power from above. The two systems were complementary expressions of the same underlying commitment to preserving the Spartan status quo against any force, external or internal helot uprising or reformist king, that threatened to change it. Understanding the Ephorate as the supervising authority of the Krypteia, rather than as a separate institution, entirely changes the picture of how Spartan social control actually worked. It was not random violence. It was organized, institutionally sanctioned, politically managed violence, and the institution that managed it held the power to prosecute kings. Subscribe to Erased from History right now, because the specific cases where Ephors used this power against kings are the most revealing documentation we have of how Sparta actually worked, and they are almost never discussed in any popular treatment of the city. Aristotle's analysis of the Spartan constitution in his Politics is the most rigorous ancient examination of the Ephorate as an institution, and it is worth engaging with directly, because Aristotle was not a casual observer. He had access to the constitutions of 158 Greek city-states as part of his systematic study of Greek political forms, and his assessment of Sparta is the evaluation of someone who had examined the full range of Greek political arrangements and could place Sparta in comparative context. His conclusion about the Ephorate was that it was essentially a tyranny embedded within a constitutional framework. He pointed out that the Ephors were elected from the whole people, which meant that very ordinary men could end up in the office, men who might be personally corruptible, financially vulnerable to bribery, or simply intellectually inadequate for the power they held. He noted that Ephors lived under the same conditions as ordinary citizens, but exercised power that kings did not have, which created a temptation toward excess that the institution's structure did nothing to restrain. He also noted that the Ephorate had no accountability mechanism directed at itself. An Ephor who abused power during his term was, after that term, simply a private citizen. There was no institutional process for holding former Ephors accountable in the way that the Ephorate itself could hold kings accountable. The institution that supervised everything was supervised by nothing. Aristotle considered this a fundamental flaw in the Spartan constitution, one that the historical record of Ephorate behavior over centuries, including bribery of oracles, execution of reformist kings, and management of foreign policy for factional advantage, substantiates with some consistency. King Cleomenes I, one of the most militarily effective Spartan kings of the classical period, the king who expelled the Athenian tyrants and intervened decisively in Greek politics at the turn of the 5th century, was exiled by the Ephors. He had bribed the oracle at Delphi to produce a favorable verdict in his campaign to depose his co-king Demaratus, whose lineage he considered illegitimate. When the bribery was discovered, the Ephors moved against him. He fled to Thessaly, then to Arcadia, where he began rallying other Greek cities against Sparta. The Ephors recalled him. He returned, possibly because his family was at risk. According to Herodotus, he was found dead shortly afterward, in circumstances that sources describe as self-inflicted wounds, but which contemporaries apparently found suspicious. Demaratus himself, the co-king, whose deposition Cleomenes had engineered through the bribed oracle, was not executed. He was simply removed from the kingship and replaced. He subsequently defected to Persia and served as an advisor to Xerxes during the Persian invasion, the same invasion that produced Thermopylae. The king who sat in the Persian war council, advising on how to defeat Greece, was a former Spartan king removed from power by his own city's institutional mechanisms. King Pausanias, the Spartan general who commanded the Greek forces at Krypteia in 479 BC, the battle that definitively ended the Persian invasion, was put on trial twice by the Ephors. The first trial, on charges of medising, which meant collaborating with Persia, resulted in acquittal. The second trial, on similar charges, ended with Pausanias taking refuge in a temple to avoid arrest. The Ephors sealed the temple. According to Thucydides, they received word that they were about to arrest an innocent man from a source they trusted, and ordered the temple unsealed. Pausanias was brought out alive and died of starvation almost immediately afterward. Thucydides notes that the Spartans were subsequently troubled by having allowed a suppliant to die in a temple and made reparations to the gods. King Agis IV, ruling in the 3rd century BC, attempted to reform Sparta's increasingly unequal land distribution. By this point, most Spartan land had concentrated in the hands of a small number of families, leaving the majority of citizens unable to maintain the financial requirements for full citizenship. His reforms were blocked. He was arrested by the Ephors, tried before a court that included the Ephors themselves, convicted, and executed. He was approximately 26 years old. His execution was so striking to contemporaries that it became one of the most discussed episodes of late Spartan history. His mother and grandmother, who had supported his reforms and who were prominent members of the Spartan women's wealthy landowning class, were executed alongside him. King Cleomenes III, inspired by Agis IV's attempt, tried a different approach. He waited until the Ephors who opposed his planned reforms were in a position where he could act against them directly, then had them assassinated. He killed 4 of the 5 sitting Ephors in a single night and abolished the Ephorate entirely, replacing it with a council he controlled. His reforms went through. For a brief period, Sparta had a genuinely reformist king, implementing land redistribution and debt cancellation. The Macedonian king, Antigonus Doson, allied with the restored Achaean League, defeated Cleomenes at the Battle of Silesia in 222 BC. The Ephorate was restored. The reforms were reversed. The monthly oath ceremony between the Ephors and the kings is one of the most revealing constitutional details in the entire Spartan system, and it receives almost no attention in popular treatments of Sparta, despite being documented in multiple ancient sources. Every month, the Ephors swore an oath on behalf of the city to maintain the king's authority, provided the king observed the laws. The kings swore an oath on their own behalf to do exactly that, observe the laws. The asymmetry is constitutional, not ceremonial. The Ephors represented the collective authority of the state, making a conditional promise to the king. The king made a personal promise to the state, represented by the Ephors. This means that the Ephors, acting collectively, held the power to determine whether the condition of the oath had been met. If they decided the king had violated the laws, and they were the supreme court that made that determination, the oath they had sworn was dissolved. The king's authority, which the oath had been maintaining, was consequently dissolved with it. The entire legal basis for a king's power ran through an institutional mechanism the Ephors controlled. No king could appeal over the Ephors to some higher authority, because there was no higher authority. The oracle at Delphi could provide a verdict, but the Ephors also managed the relationship with Delphi, which is why when Cleomenes bribed the oracle to produce a favorable verdict, the discovery that he had done so was itself processed as a violation of the laws, and the Ephors moved against him. The system was closed. The Ephorate was, in the constitutional structure of Sparta, both the police and the court and the prison. The pattern across these cases is consistent enough to constitute a documented institutional dynamic. The Ephorate was the mechanism through which Sparta's conservative landowning establishment maintained control against any king who threatened to change the distribution of wealth and power. When a king attempted genuine reform, Agis IV through legal means, Cleomenes III through violence, the Ephorate either executed him or was itself destroyed in the attempt to stop him. Every time the ephorate was abolished or bypassed, external military pressure eventually restored it. This is not the Sparta of the films. The Sparta of the films is a meritocratic military society where the strongest and best rise to lead. The documented Sparta of the historical record is a society where a council of 5 annually elected officials controlled everything, including the kings, where 2 of those kings were deposed or killed in documented succession conflicts within the same century, where a king who tried to redistribute land was executed alongside his mother and grandmother, and where another king had to murder the entire ephorate before his reforms could go through. The Krypteia killed helots. The Ephors killed kings. Hollywood chose the Krypteia because it is visceral and can be staged. The ephorate is harder to dramatize because its power was bureaucratic, procedural, and most devastating when it was exercised through trials, decrees, and the slow machinery of institutional control, rather than through midnight violence in the countryside. But the institution that shaped Sparta's actual political history, that decided when kings could fight and when they had to stop, that managed Sparta's foreign policy by the time of the Persian Wars, that preserved the conservative land distribution, that eventually caused the oliganthropia, that made Leuctra catastrophic, was the ephorate, 5 ordinary citizens elected for 1 year who could do to a king what no one could do to them. The case of King Leotychidas II is worth examining separately because it illustrates the ephorate's power in a slightly different way from the more dramatic depositions and executions. Leotychidas was the king who replaced Demaratus after Cleomenes the Formoid engineered Demaratus's removal, the co-king who benefited from the same bribery of the oracle that eventually destroyed Cleomenes. He served for decades, commanded the Greek naval forces at Mycale in 479 BC in the campaign that completed the defeat of the Persian invasion, and was generally considered a successful military commander. He was then sent on a campaign in Thessaly to support Greek factions who had collaborated with Persia, and was caught, according to Herodotus, sitting on a glove stuffed with silver that he had accepted as a bribe from the Alawade. The Ephors put him on trial. He was convicted of bribery and sentenced to exile. His house in Sparta was demolished. The king who had commanded Greek forces at Mycale, who had been instrumental in the final defeat of the Persian invasion, died in exile because the Ephors caught him taking a bribe and processed the offense through the institutional machinery that was specifically designed to make sure no king was above the law. This case is less dramatic than the execution of Agis IV or the temple siege of Pausanias, but it is in some ways more revealing of the ephorate's power because it shows the institution functioning in its routine mode, not the extreme response to a reformist king who threatened the entire property structure, but the ordinary accountability mechanism that made a decorated victorious general go into exile because he got caught accepting money. Nobody talks about it. This video is why that should change. The connection between the ephorate and Sparta's eventual decline is a thread that runs through the entire history of the institution in a way that Aristotle identified and that subsequent events confirmed. The ephorate was specifically designed to preserve the existing distribution of power and wealth in Sparta. It did this successfully, so successfully that the concentration of land in fewer and fewer hands that was already visible by Aristotle's time continued unchecked until it had reduced the citizen military class to the dangerously small numbers that made Leuctra catastrophic. Agis IV saw this and tried to fix it. The Ephors killed him. Cleomenes III saw this and tried to fix it through more drastic means. He had to abolish the ephorate itself to do so, and his reforms were reversed when he was militarily defeated. The institution that was designed to preserve Sparta preserved exactly the conditions that destroyed it. This is not a coincidence or an irony. It is the predictable outcome of an institution whose purpose was stability rather than adaptability, whose power derived from preventing change rather than managing it, and whose annual election from the conservative landowning citizen class ensured that the interests it represented were never the interests of reform. The Ephorate was not a failure of Spartan governance. It was Spartan governance working exactly as designed, right up until the design proved fatal. If you want the history they erased from the films, subscribe to Erased from History, because next week we go somewhere even darker.